Hi, this is Kim Eierman from EcoBeneficial, bringing you more useful tips to help improve our environment. Today, I have the pleasure of speaking with Russ Cohen. Now, Russ is a naturalist and a wild foods enthusiast, and he has been leading walks and talks about wild edible plants for over 45 years, so he really knows his stuff. And since 2015, Russ has had a special focus on native edibles. Russ, thank you so much for joining me today.
My pleasure.
Now, you're up in Massachusetts, and I'm here in New York, so we actually have quite a few plants in common. So I'm going to ask you, what are some of your favorite native edibles that you think are ornamental in the garden and might be an easy first second plant to include in your landscape where you could actually enjoy not only the beauty of the plant, but whatever the food it is that it provides?
Right. Well, the first that comes automatically to mind is the genus Amelanchier, which is known by lots of different common names like Juneberry or Shadbush or Shadblow or Serviceberry or Saskatoon. It's all the same thing. There are many different species. They hybridize. They're kind of hard to tell apart, but as a forager or a plant nibbler, you absolutely don't need to know how to tell them apart because they're all edible the exact same way. And so this is actually a native species that is deployed quite a lot in landscaping already because people are planting it not because it's edible by people, but because it's an early bloomer.
Mm-hmm.
So the Amelanchier flowers tend to come out about 2 weeks before the crabapples do. So it's an early display, which appeals to a lot of people. And the flowers are...
And pollinators.
Yes, and the flowers are relatively large and numerous and showy, and so that's all good. But it isn't just a flowering plant, it's a flowering and fruiting plant. And so because it gets an early start in the flowering, it gets a relatively early start in the fruiting, which is why it's called Juneberry, because that's when the fruit is usually ripe here in the Northeast. And so when the fruit is ripe, it has a purpley cast to it with a little bloom on it, kind of like a blueberry. And it's got the little crown on the end, which looks like a blueberry too. So you could possibly mistake it for blueberry until you put it in your mouth. And then you discover the flavor is quite different. It's really like a cross between a cherry and an almond, which is not that surprising because Juneberry and cherry and almond are all related plants in the rose family.
Right, right. And have you found that any particular species is more palatable than another?
Well, there's some variety in palatability from species to species and also from bush to bush and from growing location to growing location. So there's absolutely no harm in just doing a little trial and error right on the spot and see if you've got a good one.
Right.
I find that to be a general case with wild fruit, whether it's native or not, is there's a lot of variability in flavor from bush to bush. And that could be also with wild nuts too. We might talk about Shagbark Hickory nuts later.
Sure.
That's my favorite wild edible. And I definitely have some trees which I consider better tasting than other ones.
And probably some of it's soil, I would imagine, and who knows what else.
And genetics.
Sure, and genetics, exactly, because biodiversity is our key driver for ecosystem health. So we actually do want to be incorporating straight species as our priority as opposed to cultivars.
Right.
But one of the advantages, of course, of cultivars is, you do have maybe some more consistency of flavor, right?
Yeah, but that has never, I'm not growing or cultivating or propagating cultivars in my nursery. And
talk about your nursery, Russ, before we
Sure.
continue
So
that.
when about 5 or 6 years ago, when I was realizing that I was getting ready to retire from my day job with the Massachusetts Fish and Game Department, it suddenly occurred to me that I had an opportunity to give back to nature in gratitude for nature providing all these wonderful things I've been nibbling on all these years in the form of propagating and planting edible native species in appropriate places in the landscape. And so that's when I set up this nursery that now has over 1,000 plants in it. And those are plants of many of the species. We have over 180 species that are native to bioregions in the Northeast U.S. that are edible by people. So it's a pretty big palette to work with. I can't say I've been successful in growing all of them, but I probably have about 40% of them now in
That's
my
great.
nursery.
Now, your nursery is not a commercial nursery per
Right,
se.
right.
Explain how it works.
Okay, so I am growing plants to give away to land trusts and cities and towns, state and federal agencies, tribal groups, organic farms, and others, so they can plant them in appropriate places in their properties. And my hope is that the public will be able to interact with them. So, and it doesn't mean necessarily that the plants have to go in on sites where foraging is allowed. For example, I do a lot of partnerships with various Audubon groups, and Audubon sanctuaries tend to be they don't want people going in with baskets and filling them up with,
Right.
berries and nuts and stuff like that.
For the
They're intended to
birds.
be left for the wildlife, right, which is fine. But it is a place where people can certainly see the plants that I'm donating and say, oh, gee, that plant's edible. It looks nice. I might want that for my yard. Or, a bird will eat a berry or a nut or, in an Audubon sanctuary and fly off with it and poop it out somewhere else and start a new colony along a bike path or a vacant lot or the edge of a school ball field or a place where you could pick them.
Right. So your nursery work is focused on organizations and land in Massachusetts, then, correct?
No, it's actually all 6 New England states and Eastern New
Oh,
York State.
that's fantastic.
Yeah.
So if people have a need for some plants, can they get in touch with you?
Well, yes, absolutely. They can
Okay.
send me an email. My email is eatwild, EATWILD @rcn.com.
That's fantastic.
But once again, these plants aren't for people's backyards.
Right. No, these are for conservation efforts.
Right, but certainly if they have a property that they'd like me to evaluate as to see how suitable it might be for diversifying what's already there with some additional native wild edibles that are appropriate to the site, I'm happy to explore that and then make a list of suggestions. And so I've done
terrific.
that so far on 30 different sites.
Oh, that's great.
And sometimes the only plants we end up planting are plants I donate from my nursery. And then sometimes the organization might have a budget or a project with a budget where they can supplement what I'm able to provide with some additional stuff that they can acquire from a good native plant nursery in the area.
All right. Well, that's terrific. Well, good news is the plants that we're talking about now, Amelanchier, Juneberry, Shadbush, serviceberries, that whole group, they're pretty available in a lot of nurseries. It's always a good idea, again, to focus on buying straight species. But one thing I love about them is they typically are self-fertile. Do you find that that's the case? So they don't need a pollinator partner.
Yeah, where I usually see them is where there's more than one, so I can't say that for sure. But they're often deployed in the landscape where there's more than one, I think, for visual effect. And certainly if somebody wants to plant it on their property and they have space for more than one, I would recommend that.
It looks better. It looks better,
It looks
right?
better, and also I think you'll get better fruit production.
Yeah. I mean, with a lot of these plants that maybe don't require cross-pollination, they may benefit from it.
Right. Now, one that definitely does require cross-pollination, you will not get any fruit with just one plant, is beech plum.
Right. Let's talk about beech plum. That's a great plant. I think is underutilized in just kind of average landscapes, parking lots. Great candidate for parking lots.
Absolutely.
Very salt tolerant.
Yeah, when you consider the the microclimate of a parking lot, that it's hot and dry, just like a dune, a sand dune.
Right. A lot of salt spray.
Right. Yeah. So it's amazing how, taking that into consideration, how rarely beech plum is utilized in a situation like that, I've seen it utilized and it thrives in places like that, as you would expect it to.
Talk a little bit about the plant. Describe it for the listeners.
Yeah. So beech plums never get to be more than about 12 feet tall, and often they're a lot smaller. And they'll often grow in the wild, in the natural habitat, in a thicket where you have many stems coming up together. But I've also seen plants that will just grow singly, or a small group of them in an area. And they do spread vegetatively under the ground through underground stems, but they also propagate really readily from seeds. So it's one of my funnest ones to grow in my nursery, because I'm gathering the beech plums, and in the Northeast, at least in New England, the time to look for the fruit to pick them is Labor Day weekend.
Okay.
You will get them beforehand and afterwards, but Labor Day is a reliable time to look for them.
Mm-hmm.
And so every single fruit I pick off a beech plum, I save that pit, and I grow a beech plum shrub from that pit.
Oh, that's
And
great.
so I've got hundreds in production in my nursery right now of beech plums that were all grown from pits of fruit that I pick myself.
Mm-hmm. And so talk a little bit about cross-pollination with that plant and how, say, a home landscaper could achieve getting genetically different plants.
Right. So of course, every one I grow from a pit is seed grown, so it's unique genetically. And what
But
you need
you don't always know that at most nurseries, right?
That's right.
You've got to ask that question. Has it been grown from seed, or is it
That's right.
vegetatively grown from a cutting?
Right.
Yep.
Although I don't see, as opposed to some fruiting bushes and trees where, there's a lot of cultivars that are, kind of the main thing that you see for sale. I don't really run into that so much with beech plums.
Yeah, you're right about that.
So anyway, you do need at least 2 bushes, though, because you won't get any, an individual bush is not self-fertile. So you need at least 2.
Mm-hmm. And again, we're not talking about male and female plants. We're talking about self-fertile, self-fruitful.
Right. Yes. So, and it probably takes from a pit to a bush that's big enough to start producing fruit. I'd say it's about 5 years.
Okay.
So
So
not
if
too
people
long.
are going to a nursery and they're saying, "What's the price on this?" Gosh, well, just realize your nursery person's been growing that thing for probably a good 5 years.
Right.
At least, yeah.
Right. So, in case you have listeners that aren't familiar with beech plums, they are generally purple when they're ripe. There is a yellowish orange variety too, I see occasionally, which is also very yummy. And the fruit
and edible right off the plant.
Oh yes,
right?
Yeah. I mean, they vary, as I said, they vary from bush to bush, but sometimes they're just about as good as any plum you commercial plum you grow in your yard or buy at the store.
And a very good pollinator plant, again, also in the rose family.
Right. So the fruits aren't that large. They're about as big as a Bing cherry, so much smaller than a regular plum. But a Bing cherry is a good size for wild fruit, so that's fine. And the traditional thing that's done with beech plums is to make jelly or jam, which I always do every year. And then I will often use that jelly or jam as raw material for making other things like strudel or other baked pastries. It's really fun to use beech plums.
Okay. Now, there's another prunus that I'd like to talk about, which is a little more complicated in terms of using it, but I think it's worthy of discussion because it's such an important host plant. Prunus serotina.
The black cherry.
Black cherry, yeah.
Yeah. So black cherry, it's a pioneer tree. As you often see it show up in areas that were farmed and the farm's been abandoned. And I guess probably it's just birds pooping out the pits that will sprout and grow trees. And yeah, although a black cherry, wood makers know black cherry because the wood's so valuable for, like if you hear about a cherry cabinet, that means black cherry is what it's made from. And so when the trees get to be very big, as they do down your way, that's how a lot of people value the tree. But the fruit is also, as I said, variable in flavor from tree to tree. But in trees where the branches are low enough that you can reach the fruit and it's ripe, I would say toward the end of August is when to look for it. And some fruits is puckery and astringent, and some are sweet and just about as good as a cultivated cherry, except for the fact that the fruit are small. Black cherries will approach, but not quite get to a half an inch in diameter, and the pits inside each fruit aren't that much smaller than conventional cherry pits. So I don't recommend to people that they gather black cherries to use in any recipe that require pitting each individual fruit, because that would be exceedingly tiresome.
And there's cyanide, some degree of cyanide in those pits, as I understand.
Oh, but that's true in apple seeds and a lot of other plants in the rose family. So as long as you're just eating the pulp off the fruit, that's not a concern at all.
Right. And then one concern maybe if you happen to have cattle or horses is the leaves are pretty toxic in quantity.
Right.
Um,
Right. Well,
so
that also is a cyanide related thing that
right.
can be in the wilted foliage, and
Hmm.
yeah. So there are things to be concerned about with every single plant you
Hmm.
put in your yard, whether it's native or not, and that just happens to be the one for that one.
And yeah, and let's just make this call out for, if you're going to forage, make sure that you're learning first, going with somebody like you and learning the identification characteristics or using good field guides, etc. But if you're buying plants to incorporate in your landscape, then you're good to go. So always caution people, no plants before you eat them, please.
All right, so well taken, but you're just reminding me the point I like to make in a lot of the talks, because a lot of the audience I talk to are the same kind of groups that you talk to, where you
Hmm.
have people that are very eager to plant native plants for the ecological benefits,
Right.
for the pollinators, for the birds, and all that stuff. And of course, that's exceedingly important, and I'm totally supportive of that. The angle I like to talk about, though, is because I realize that although some people, they've heard Doug Tallamy speak or bought his book, and they are convinced they have to go that way. There is a group of people that are just kind of like the yard the way it is, and they're not really motivated to change anything. And that's when they can go to one of my talks, and I could say, all right, here's all
You
these
can
native
eat it.
plants. Right. And you can eat it too. And the fact that many of our native plants are edible by people, I think, provides a powerful additional incentive for people to
Totally.
plant them that might not be thoroughly convinced to do so on just a pure ecological argument.
And a great way to get kids engaged with the landscape too.
Right,
Teach them the whole cycle of how this all happens. I
right.
think that's kind of cool. Well, that's great. Well, a lot of people are growing blueberries of some sort,
Right.
and maybe some people are growing them properly and some are not. So, talk a little bit about the different vaccinium species and best practices for growing and being
Well, the
successful, et
main
cetera.
the main ones that you encounter in the wild would be the high bush and the low bush
Hmm.
blueberry, and um, the high bush blueberry can tolerate quite a bit of wet habitat. In the wild, you often see it in wetlands or right on the edge of a stream or a pond or lake, something like that. And actually, one of the for people that are gathering them for the wild, it's a tip I give folks up here in our area of the world. Is in July, you can launch a boat in one of our ponds with a natural shoreline, and the high bush blueberries overhang the water, and that's when the fruit is ripe, and you can just stuff your face right from the seat of your canoe or your kayak. But certainly, blueberries are a great example of a plant that people are familiar with. So no kind of scary. I don't know what this is. Just about everybody has encountered blueberries in the wild, and so the idea of having a blueberry bush at home doesn't seem very scary, and is kind of a pretty easy step for just about everybody to make. What I would say, though, is they do require acidic soil. And so you'll have to mend your soil if you don't already have acidic soil. Up here in New England, it's the predominant condition, so it's not really that much
Hmm.
of an issue. And then in general, a sunny spot is good because there's a general correlation between sun and fruit production, that in general, the sunnier spot you have, the more fruit you're going to get. It's kind of like tomatoes in your garden.
Hmm.
Same thing.
And another one for cross pollination.
Right. And so that is one where if you do go to your nursery and you try to buy a high bush blueberry, for example, you're almost always going to see a cultivar. And although in general I'm a straight species fan,
Hmm.
I think in the case of blueberries, somebody might make the argument that a cultivar is similar enough to a straight species blueberry in terms of the pollinators, in terms of the birds and other wildlife. They can still recognize it as food. They can still pollinate the flowers, that it's not, um, it's still helpful ecologically, even if it is a
Hmm.
cultivar.
And it can be tricky trying to find genetically different plants from different nurseries that have been grown from seed, or potentially vegetatively, and going to different nurseries. That can be quite a chore, and then
Though,
you don't know
if
if they're going to bloom at the same time.
well, that is true, and that's an issue. And actually, in our yard, we have at least a dozen blueberries in our yard, and
Mm-hmm.
they're like 4 or 5 different types. We have 4 low bush blueberries, and then the rest are high bush blueberries. And when they start producing in around the first day of summer, we are still picking fruit in August.
Mm-hmm.
So they
Mm-hmm.
run that entire time. It's because, and I can't claim very intentional planning on my part, but it so happens that the plants that we have, just through a succession of blooming and fruiting and ripening and all that stuff, they just keep going and going for
Mm-hmm.
the entire time period.
Sounds like they're planted in the right place and they're happy.
Yes.
Well,
Yeah.
some plants that are often used, native plants in on landscapes that are planting natives, are viburnums. But not everybody knows that we have some edible viburnums that are very good.
Yeah.
So
So,
talk
well,
about those.
so the good news is there aren't any poisonous viburnums. So
Perfect.
any viburnum you can put in your mouth. If it doesn't taste good, spit it out. No harm done whatsoever. So, for example, maple leaf viburnum doesn't taste good. Arrowwood viburnum dentatum fruit doesn't taste good. Not poisonous, just doesn't taste good.
Mm-hmm.
So, of the edible viburnums, there are probably 4 that I would highlight, maybe 5. So, let's talk about the wild raisin, for example, Viburnum nudum, or some people call it casinoides. So that one can tolerate a fairly wide variety of conditions. I've seen it grow in wet areas, dry areas, rocky areas, non-rocky areas, and the fruit is relatively small. And it's not like a seedless raisin; they do have seeds in them, and viburnum seeds are rather big. But you can still chew off that edible fruit pulp, and the clusters of fruit on the plant are nice to look at because they often, you'll have the immature fruit, which are a nice pink color, and then the ripe fruit, which are a blue color on the plant at the
Yeah,
same
it's pretty.
time.
It's very pretty.
Yeah, so that's nice. And then in terms of a larger fruit to eat, I would think of 3 viburnums, the Viburnum lentago or nanny berry, and then the Viburnum prunifolium or black haw. And then as you get further north, in the Northeast, you might run into the Viburnum lanthanoides, and that would be the hobblebush or
Right.
moosewood.
Mm-hmm.
And that might be my favorite in terms of the tastiness of the fruit because the fruits will be black in color when they're ripe and soft, and the texture will be kind of like a stewed prune, but they have an extra little kind of a clovey type spice in there. So they're very fun for nibbling on the bush when you're hiking in the late summer and early fall.
That sounds good. And so we have this other issue of cross pollination again, right? with native viburnums, they're not reliably self-fruitful in some cases.
Yeah, and I have to profess my ignorance about that because once again, when I'm encountering viburnums, I'm usually seeing more
Right.
than one. So
Right.
I
But for
don't.
people that want to buy these and introduce them to the home landscape, having 2 genetically different viburnums of the same species is really important.
Oh, okay.
And that's pretty straightforward with everything except Viburnum dentatum arrowwood, because there are some differences in bloom time with Viburnum dentatum, with cultivars, etc. But
Right.
I have a post about that I'll be sharing. But that's great to know. So they're tasty too. And share with the birds, guys, and some of the mammals like possums that enjoy this. Nothing horrifies me more than seeing people caging up all of their blueberries soon. No other creature can share a
Right.
little bit, right?
Right. Well, I find, I mean, I'll be honest, I net our blueberries too, but the birds seem to get their share just by sitting on
Okay,
top of
okay.
the
As
net
long
and
as they're getting
poking through.
something.
Yeah.
How about some
Eh,
other things that are native edibles that
yeah. Well,
you
let's
can eat
talk
right
about
off
the
the...
rubus genus
Oh, yes,
because
please.
that's a huge one.
Yeah, that
And
is.
that's also one that people are already very familiar with.
Mm-hmm.
And, um, and so this, of course, is raspberries and blackberries and dewberries and of those plants, the one that people might not be familiar with that I think is definitely worth considering for your yard is a plant called the flowering raspberry, Rubus odoratus.
Beautiful plant.
Yes, and it's worth considering for planting even if you never ate it because
Mm-hmm.
it's so pretty. It's got those large maple-like leaves. It's got those very showy magenta-colored flowers, and then a fruit afterwards. And although I'll be honest, a regular red raspberry is probably a tastier fruit than a flowering raspberry. It's definitely still edible,
Mm-hmm.
and definitely if you get this growing on your property, and it likes damp, dappled shade, often a slopey areas where I tend to see it in the wild, and I've seen it planted in habitats like that, and it does very well, and it will naturally spread like plants in the rubus genus tend to do. And once it gets really cranking, you absolutely from one patch could pick enough fruit to make a batch of jam or something with it, other than just eating it right off the plant.
And it doesn't have a layering habit, which makes it a little bit easier to plant, doesn't it?
And it also doesn't have thorns.
Yeah,
Yeah.
bingo. Underutilized native for a shady, part shade condition. Yeah, absolutely. Any other of the rubus that you are particularly fond of?
Well, for people that might have, let's say, kind of a dry, sandy place,
Mm-hmm.
where they're looking for a kind of a ground cover that might be more interesting than just, the typical stuff that's grown, and it's not a place where you need to walk a lot. I mean, you could have a path next to it, but next to the path, you could have dewberry. And there's several different species of plants that are where the common name is dewberry. It's basically a prostrate blackberry. So if you can imagine a plant that blooms like a blackberry, produces fruit like a blackberry, but instead of having tall canes like a blackberry, it sprawls along the ground. That's a dewberry.
Terrific ground cover.
Yeah, but the fruit is really tasty,
Mm-hmm.
and the flowers are nice to look at, and that's a plant that I think is probably would go on the underappreciated side in
Mm-hmm.
terms of people thinking about deploying it in the landscape.
And I'd say that I'd make that argument for our Fragaria virginiana, our
Right,
strawberry.
right. So wild
Talk about
strawberry,
that.
though, the difference there is that is something that you absolutely could plant in the lawn,
Yeah, yeah.
and that the wild strawberry as well as the violet, and the one I'm thinking of is Viola Saawariya,
Mm-hmm.
the common violet.
Mm-hmm.
Um, they do really well in lawns, and they don't mind getting mowed or stepped on, and they bloom. And of course, the pollinators are visiting those flowers. In the case of the strawberry, you've got those delectable little fruits to enjoy later. And so, even if you have an area of lawn and you just can't give it up, you could certainly diversify it with wild strawberry or the violet.
That's a terrific a suggestion. And our violets. So talk about the edibility of our. We have lots of violets. Talk
Right.
about
So
your
the one
favorites.
the one I recommend for eating is the Viola Saawariya, because first of all, we have some rare violets in the Northeast that people should not be picking from the wild. And this is the Viola Saawariya is the one that you're probably the most familiar with. It's the heart-shaped, glossy, dark green leaf with the purple flowers. And it's also the most common one. And in that one, the flowers are edible straight off the plant into your mouth. They're used in salads, or you can candy them and then use them to decorate other dishes. And then the leaves are edible, especially when the flowers are out, before the flowers come out. After the flowers come out, they're not quite as good. But
Mm-hmm.
when the flowers are out beforehand, you can eat them raw, you can eat them cooked. And they're very good for you because they have more, by weight, they have more vitamin A than carrots and more vitamin C than oranges.
And so, like a lot of the plants we're discussing, there's also a good pollinator plant, but this one has an additional attribute, which it's a host plant for fritillary butterfly
Oh, there
caterpillars.
we go.
So, yeah, if you're getting freaked out because you have violets in your lawn, leave them alone
Yeah,
and mow high.
right. So I should tell you that I do have violets in my nursery, but I haven't yet figured out how to propagate them from seed.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure it's doable. I just haven't figured it out. But what I can do is um, we have so many in our little lawn at our house is I can just dig up a plant here or there, pot them up, and then take them to my nursery and then deploy them on other landscapes where they're not growing. And because they're such good spreaders vegetatively as well as by seed,
Mm-hmm.
those plants that are I pull out of my yard, they fill right in, and I can just keep taking from the yard and without depleting my supply.
That's great. Now, in your book, you also talk about our native huckleberry. Now, this is a different huckleberry than we see on the West Coast. So talk
Right.
about those.
Right. So this is Gala Satia. So there's the black huckleberry is probably the one that the most people are familiar with. It's a low-growing plant. I tend to see it association with oak trees, and it's quite common here in southern New England. And it will tolerate a little drier habitat than blueberries tend to grow in. And although you'll probably get the most optimal amount of fruit production if the plants are in the sun, it's a plant that tolerates the shade quite well and will flower and fruit well in the shade. And so if that's your situation, you're looking for what could I grow as an understory plant under some oak trees, a black huckleberry would be an excellent choice.
I think it's defined as a subshrub, kind of a
Right.
small shrub.
Right.
Yep.
And then its
go ahead.
cousin, the blue huckleberry, that's one that's I don't think is well known at all. This is let me see what Galaceae frondosa, right? And the fun thing about that one is, so the other name for it is dangleberry, is that I often find the fruit still on that plant in September. And who thinks about picking blueberry type fruits in September? It's usually way too late, but not for that species.
Well, that's great too, because that persistent fruit is going to become more and more important for our wildlife with climate change. So that's something to consider. Now, there's a species that I've grown with mixed success. I don't know if you have it in Massachusetts, called Galaceae brachycera, box huckleberry.
No,
I think that may be more of a southern. It's a beautiful plant, a little tricky to grow though. And big colonies. There's an enormous colony of it in Pennsylvania that goes on for, I think, actually miles. One plant. It's a quite ancient plant. So there are all sorts of other things you can eat. You've alluded to some of the nuts and talk about your favorites there.
Okay, so all the nuts are edible, although they're of varying yumminess. So there's hazelnuts. We have two species that are native to the Northeast. There's the common hazelnut and the Beet Hazelnut, and the only difference is the appearance of the husks surrounding the nut.
So and those are really cool. Those husks, they're ornamental in and of themselves.
Yeah. So the common hazelnut looks like a little head of cabbage, about an inch in diameter. And when the nut ripens, the two halves of the little covering open up, and you can see the nut inside. And eventually, the nut either falls out of the husk or the whole husk falls on the ground. And then the other one is even more interesting looking. That's the Beet Hazelnut, where the nut is developing in this spherical, fuzzy green ball. And one end of it is this long thing sticking out that looks like a green bird's beak, and it could be like an inch and a half long. And when those ripen, the entire husk falls on the ground. And then, so my advice is, if you're trying to gather hazelnuts, and whether it's from bushes in the wild or bushes in your yard, my advice is don't wait till the nuts hit the ground, because you'll never find them. The squirrels and chipmunks will get all of them before you get any.
Okay.
So you do need to pick some for yourself. It's fine if they get some, but for yourself, you need to try to time your picking so it's as close as possible when the nuts are ripe, but when they're still attached to the plant. And in the Boston area, that is September 8th. And so when I was working, I would find some excuse to be out of the office for part of the day, and I'd go off into some of my favorite places where the hazelnuts grow, and I would gather hundreds and hundreds of hazelnuts from these wild places. And they were so prolific that wasn't really making a dent in how much was there. And then you're gathering them, as I said, slightly underripe. So I would just spread them on newspapers in my floor of my garage for a couple of weeks, and the husk turned brown, and then the nuts pop out easily from the husk at that point.
Okay.
And in our native hazelnuts, they're more diminutive than a cultivated hazelnut, and they have the same flavor as a cultivated hazelnut. So I would be misleading people if I said, you haven't lived to try the flavor of a wild hazelnut, because it's the same flavor as a regular one. And they're smaller. And so some people might say, I think I'll go to the store and buy hazelnuts, would be perfectly fine. Or I can understand if, somebody said, well, if I'm going to plant a hazelnut in my yard, I want big nuts. I don't want the native one. And I would understand that. But, I'm propagating the native nuts in my nursery. They do very well. So when I gather all those nuts, I eat some of the nuts, but I save some for growing into new hazelnut trees. And I must have at least 3 dozen developing hazelnut seedlings in my nursery now that I grew from wild nuts that I gathered and
So
propagated.
these are the Carolus species, and
Right.
these are wind pollinated plants, which sounds like, oh, okay, well, they actually don't have use for pollinators. But from what I've read in research, they have quite a bit of pollen very early in the season, and
That's right.
some early emerging bees may actually utilize some of that low quality pollen from some of the early emerging ones. So you never
And
know what plants do, right?
right. And yes, it's important to plant for our pollinators, but the other animals need food too. So
Sure.
yeah.
But that's kind of an additional bonus. And what are some of the other nuts that you're particularly fond
All
of
right.
that's native?
So there's the juglans species, so the butternuts and the black walnuts. And then my favorite is the Carya species. So my favorite would be Carya ovata, the shagbark hickory. And before I get to the edibility part, I learned an interesting thing a couple of years ago when I was listening to a radio program where a landowner in Vermont invited a bat expert onto his
Oh,
property.
yeah.
I'd like to know what I can do for my property that
Right.
will help promote bats.
Right.
And the guy walked the property and he said, you already have a really good thing on your property,
Yep.
all these mature shagbark hickory trees.
Yep.
And I understand that it's not just the bats, but
No.
sometimes the lepidoptera will
Right.
also go underneath that bark and
That
hang.
exfoliating bark.
Right.
Yeah, it's very pronounced. So yeah, think habitat too, not just edibility.
Right. But it is, as I said, my number one favorite wild edible out of everything that's out there. I love to gather the nuts. I love to process the nuts. I love to eat them. We have them in our oatmeal every morning. They're really fun to bake with. In my book, I've got a recipe for maple hickory nut pie, which is a New England equivalent of a pecan pie. Only
that sounds
virtually
good.
everybody I feed it to say, this is better than pecan pie.
And let me just mention your book, Wild Plants I Have Known and Eaten, which you can buy on Amazon. Or
yes, you can.
I'm sure
You
you can
can
buy it
also
elsewhere too, but it's there.
Yeah, so the one place you might want to get it is the Land Trust that published the book, which is the Essex County Greenbelt Association.
Okay.
And they have a very easy URL. It's ecga.org.
Yeah, support the Land Trust for sure.
Right.
Okay.
And they allow foraging as a permitted activity in all their properties that are open to the public. So that's a reason why, in gratitude for that, I just give them all the money that the book proceeds come in for. So however you're buying them through Amazon or whatever, all the money goes to Greenbelt.
Oh, that's really nice. So shagbark nuts, do you ever eat them raw, or do you just
Sure.
them?
No. And that's one nice thing about them. Like, we haven't mentioned acorns yet. So all acorns are edible if you leach the tannic acid out of them first. It's pretty hard to find an acorn that's going to be palatable straight into your mouth from the nut. But shagbark hickories are always palatable straight into your mouth after you shell them. And usually when I talk about them on my programs, people say, how do you get the darn things open? And I have a technique, and it's hard to describe in a podcast, but if you hold the nut on its side with the two pointy ends pointing to the left and to the right, and you hit straight down on it with a hammer, and you don't pulverize it, but you hit it just hard enough to send cracks through the shell, more often than not, the two halves open right up, and that's how you're able to extract big pieces out of the shell without having to use a nut pick to get everything out.
It's black walnuts come to mind too. That they're kind of a beast.
Yeah, so black walnuts.
Those open.
I'm not sure this company exists anymore, but there was at one point a company in Oklahoma that manufactured a nutcracker specifically for black walnuts. I bought one. And this thing, it's made out of cast iron. It weighs 10 pounds. It looks like a torture in the Middle Ages, and it exerts a tremendous amount of torque on the nut. And finally, the nut explodes from all the pressure, but there's this little metal flange that you drop over the nut, so the pieces just fall into the tray. And that's what I use to get my black walnuts open. And black walnuts are also perfectly edible straight out of the shell. But they have a kind of an aromatic quality that some people don't like as much in the raw state as they would, let's say, with the shagbark hickory. But the black walnuts are very nice for cooking, especially in any
Delicious.
recipe where you can pair them with honey.
Mm-hmm.
So like black walnut baklava is something that I've made that comes out really well. And an even easier recipe is black walnut honey squares, which is like a shortbread crust with the black walnuts and the honey mixed on top.
Delicious.
And it's very easy to make, and I often serve it at my programs.
Some plants that I'd like to have you talk about, and with some cautionary notes, are elderberries. Of
Right.
course, red elderberry is not edible, so
It
let's
is
start
not
with that
edible.
one.
Right.
Don't eat that one.
Right. So the black or common elderberry, which depending upon who you're talking to, it's Sambucus canadensis, or some people feel that it's a subspecies of Sambucus nigrum from Europe. But anyway, it's always called the common elderberry. That's the common name is the same. And some people will harvest the flowers and make
Yes.
drinks out of them and fry them in fritter batter. And I actually, there's another plant that I wouldn't recommend people plant. It's actually considered invasive here in New England. That's called the black locust. But it's a delicious flower.
Let's not talk about the invasives.
But anyway, but if you're going to plant elderberries, I tend to just leave the flowers on the plants, because if you pick the flowers off, you're not going to get any fruit.
Right.
Plus, the pollinators can't visit the flowers. The flowers aren't on there because you pick them. So I recommend people leave the flowers on the plant, wait for the fruit to ripen. And this will be around the same time the black cherries are ripe, so toward the end of August. And the berry clusters will hang upside down from the weight of the fruit, so that's often how you can spot them at a distance. And the fruit will be really dark purple, practically pitch black in color. And that's when they're fully ripe. And the issue about elderberries is to not eat a lot of them raw, because you can actually get a stomach ache if you do that. But if you cook them first or you dry them first, then it's safe to eat them in any quantity you want.
And I've heard straining helps also.
Straining is something that you could do. Certainly, if you're going to use the juice, let's say as a medicinal preparation, which a lot of people do, because the elderberry extract, which is basically the juice, has a good reputation as being good against the flu. And I suspect it is, but you don't have to pay the high prices that the drugstores try to charge you for that. You could absolutely make it your own. Yeah, and then you would throw the fruit in a saucepan with some water and simmer it for a while. And then, you might want to put it through a fine mesh sieve to intercept the seed. And then you could have that juice, which you could bottle up and use. That's also what you could use to make wine from,
right,
or jelly, whatever. But certainly, yes. And let me say that elderberry grows readily from seed. And so when I'm gathering the fruit, I'm saving the seed and propagating plants from the seed, and it's very easy to do. And also, if you're even less patient than that, elderberry is one of the few species that's quite easy to grow from cuttings. And basically, you can just take a cutting of an elderberry stem and shove it in the ground, and that's pretty much all you have to do.
Now, this is another plant that benefits from cross-pollination as well, genetically different one.
Okay.
Yeah. So just keep that in mind, guys. Sometimes people plant these plants and they say, why am I not getting fruit? Well, maybe your plant needs a genetically different partner. Often the case. And are there any native edibles that we haven't discussed that you're really fond of, you'd like to share some information about?
Yes. Well, let's talk about Spicebush, for example.
Oh, please do. I love that plant.
So Spicebush has got a few things going for it. First thing is, deer tend to not like it.
Yes.
And so we've got a big challenge with deer. It's worth trying to grow some Spicebush and seeing if that will be able to not get nibbled to death. Now, Spicebush is one of our native species that the American colonists turned to make tea from during the Revolutionary War era when they were boycotting the British tea. They would just steep the twigs in hot water for a few minutes and get a nice spicy flavor. And so you can still do that today. And in the case of using the twigs, it doesn't matter whether you have a male or female bush because the twigs are the same.
And let's just mention that this is a dioecious plant, guys, so you need a male and a female.
Right. And if you want those pretty red berries, then those only growing on the female plants.
On the females, right.
And most nurseries won't be able to tell you.
And the ones that do, make sure you frequent them. I know a couple, and God bless them. You want to go to those nurseries when these plants are in bloom early in the spring.
Yeah.
And a good nursery will be able to take a hand lens and tell you whether it's male or female.
Yeah.
And I like to share with people, you don't need a one-to-one there. They're not monogamous plants. I'm comfortable with maybe, 4 females to a male.
Yeah, sure. So anyway, so my favorite part to eat on a spicebush are the berries, but it isn't a berry like a blueberry. It's actually a spice, almost like a peppercorn is how you have to think of it. And in every book I've read on foraging says use them as an allspice substitute. And I just have to disagree with that because I find the flavor of spicebush to be very savory. So allspice is almost sweet, kind of like a clovey flavor. And the spicebush berry is much more like a black pepper or Szechuan peppercorn. So I would use it as flavoring for like soups, omelets, casseroles, stuff like that, where you're looking for a savory spice. And so I will dry the berries. And when you dry them, they lose the brilliant blood red color that they come as a fresh berry. They get a dull reddish brown and they wrinkle up. But once they're dried, you can store them in your pantry and they'll keep for years without going bad. And then when you're ready to use them, you just grind up a few with a little mortar and pestle and then add them to your food to get that nice spicy flavor in there. Now, I want to add, though, in the same breath that these berries are very high in lipids and vegetable fats, and our migrating songbirds know that. And so they seek out the spicebush berries to help fatten up and fuel their southward migration. So if you are going to gather berries from the plants, it's important to leave lots of berries on there so the songbirds get all they need.
A lot of foragers have certain percentages that they're comfortable in picking. Do you have such a percentage?
Well, it really depends on what you're talking about. In the case of a spicebush, you're talking about a berry with definite ecological role. And so in that case, I might show more restraint than I would, let's say, with a flowering raspberry, for example, which I don't think is performing as important a function. Because another thing about the spicebush is the fruit is ripe in September. So it is around the time when the songbirds are thinking, hey, I gotta, fuel up, whereas the flowering raspberry is a July fruit, so it's not so important for me.
And I'll make a shout out for viburnums, native viburnums too, being really important for migrating birds. So, share.
Right.
So give us, I'm sorry, go ahead, Russ.
And then, other fun plants to talk about would be, for example, sweet goldenrod. So goldenrod is held in high esteem for people trying to plant pollinator gardens. And there are some goldenrods that are rather thuggish in the landscape, like the Canada goldenrod can really take over an area and kind of monopolize habitat. Well, the sweet goldenrod doesn't do that. It tends to grow in clumps. And so it will share a habitat with lots of other things. But it's an edible goldenrod. How cool is that? The flowers and the leaves taste like licorice. And so it's another one of our native species our American colonists turned to make tea from during the Revolutionary War era. And so when people are considering planting goldenrods in their yards, that's a fun one to consider because, you can eat it too.
That's terrific. Any other perennials native perennials that you suggest for edibility?
Well, just talking about herbaceous perennials, so anything in the mint family would fall into that category. So, for example, the monardas, like Monarda fistulosa, the wild bergamot, that's the one with the lilac-colored flowers. Now, I don't understand why it's called wild bergamot, though, because bergamot, like the flavoring in Earl Grey tea, that bergamot is actually a citrus fruit.
Right.
And so, whereas the Monarda fistulosa, there's nothing in the flavor of that plant that suggests the bergamot and Earl Grey to me. If you scrunch up a leaf or you scrunch up a flower, what you're going to smell is very similar to oregano, which is not surprising because oregano is a cultivated cousin in the mint family. And so I would put Monarda in the category, once again, of a savory plant to use in soups, omelets, casseroles, pizza toppings, stuff like that. But then other mints, like the Pycnanthemum uticum, for example, the broadleaf mountain mint, that has a really, really sharp peppery flavor. So that's when you could consider enjoying, like making a mint tea out of, for example.
And I'll just mention what I have read is it actually has a fair amount of a chemical called, I think it's called polygone or polygone. Have you heard
Yeah,
that?
I've heard of that. And I guess, well, let me just put it this way. Let's take peppermint, for example.
Mm-hmm.
So peppermint that virtually everybody has eaten.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So peppermint is toxic in large amounts. If
Okay.
you have pure oil of peppermint and you have too much, you can actually get quite sick from it.
Mm-hmm.
And so same thing with wintergreen. We haven't talked about wintergreen
Yeah,
yet.
we will. But I
That's,
just want to mention that if you're
yeah.
pregnant, you probably want to not have too much of the Pycnanthemum muticum based on what I've read.
Okay. Well, I'll go along with
Moderation.
that.
Yeah, and like any of
It's
these things, do a little research if you're
right.
pregnant
I'll
or
just say
having.
though that
Yeah,
if you tend not to be concentrating the essential oils and mints,
right.
you're just making tea from the
Sure.
naturally amount that's occurring in a leaf. It's a pretty low level.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. And wintergreen. So yes,
Right.
talk. That's a wonderful one.
Okay, so yeah, the Gaultheria procumbens is the
Mm-hmm.
common, what you'd
Mm-hmm.
call the checkerberry or the teaberry
Mm-hmm.
plant. Once again, it's an acidic lover, so that's the kind of habitat you'd expect to see it growing in, where it's going to be happy in. And although it does fun in full sun, it tolerates shade very well, especially like underneath a pine tree, for example. So if I were, and this is often true in some of the sites I work on, if I encounter pine trees there, I look underneath for wintergreen and partridgeberry. And I often see them. And if I don't, I'm pretty confident that were I to plant them there, they would do well there.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And wintergreen, you just take it right off the plant. It's delicious.
Right. Yeah. So the berries have the wintergreen flavor, and the leaves also do if you scrunch and sniff them, or you could make a tea from them. But I'll have to tell you that if I really want a wintergreen flavored drink, I tend to make it from the twigs of either black birch or yellow birch.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So this is Betula lenta or Betula allegheniensis.
Mm-hmm.
And they have the same, it's just a pure botanical coincidence because the plants are not related at all, but it's the inner bark. So you have to scrape the outer bark off with a carrot peeler, your fingernail, and then sniff the inner bark on a black or yellow birch tree, and you'll get the oil of wintergreen
Mm-hmm.
flavor
Mm-hmm.
because
Mm-hmm.
it's the same chemical, methyl salicylate, that's in the wintergreen
Mm-hmm.
plants.
And I'll ask you about one last plant, two-leaf toothwort. How do you use that for
Okay,
eating?
so this is a plant we've been talking a lot about. Plants that like acid soil. This is a plant that I would say tends to like less acid soil.
Mm-hmm.
That's where you're going to see it. And I've certainly seen places where toothwort can carpet the woods in the spring. So it's your classic spring ephemeral wildflower,
Mm-hmm.
where it's pretty much going to do its thing in the 6-week period between when the ground becomes unfrozen and when you get full leaf out in the tree canopy. And that's when you get these diminutive little plants, usually get about 8 or 9 inches tall, with a nice 4-petal white flower. Being in the mustard family, that's your characteristic flower structure.
Mm-hmm.
And it's called toothwort because if you, and of course you wouldn't want to do this unless A, you have permission, and B, there's lots of plants to dig up. It's the root of a toothwort plant that almost reminds you of teeth, the way that the little rhizome is white and the little pieces of it look like teeth that are kind of stuck together. And if you scratch and sniff it or you bite into it, you'll see that the flavor is very, very similar to horseradish.
Mm-hmm.
So if you said, well, I've heard of horseradish and I could grow that in my garden, but it's not a native plant. I'd like to grow a native plant, but also be able to have some horseradish to harvest. Toothwort would be a plant I'd
Mm-hmm.
recommend for that.
Mm-hmm. And as a spring ephemeral, it's got particular importance to some of our early emerging pollinators. So keep that in mind too, folks. Well, thank you so much, Russ. For listeners, if you'd like to learn more about Russ, Google Russ Cohen, Eat Wild, and take a look for his book on Amazon. And remind us of the land trust where they can get this book, Wild
Sure.
Plants I've Known and Eaten.
Yeah, so that's the Essex County Greenbelt Association,
Okay.
or ecga.org.
Well, thank you so much, Russ. I hope you'll spend some time with us again for another podcast.
Thank you. Great talking to you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.